Good evening. I'm Bob Berdahl, and I have the pleasure of being Chancellor of this university and also the great pleasure of introducing this program tonight, a lively rematch of the debate between Christopher Hitchens, contributing editor at Vanity Fair and former I.F. Stone Fellow at the Journalism School, and Mark Danner, professor at the Journalism School and staff writer for The New Yorker. The debate tonight is sponsored by the Goldman Forum on Press and Foreign Affairs. This series of lectures, dialogues, scholarships that it provides is meant to foster debate on how critical world issues are covered in the American media and how they can be covered more effectively. We're very grateful for the support of Richard Goldman, one of the university's major benefactors and friends. Our hosts tonight are the Berkeley School of Journalism and the World Affairs Council of Northern California. I will introduce in a moment Orville Schell, who will provide the ground rules for tonight's debate. But let me first introduce our speakers. Christopher Hitchens contributes an essay on books each month to the Atlantic Monthly. He is the author of more than 10 books, and most recently, A Long Short War, The Postponed Liberation of Iraq. He's a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, has written for many American and English periodicals, including The Nation, the London Review of Books, the Los Angeles Times Book Review, Slate, the New York Review of Books, Newsweek, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Washington Post. Hitchens began his career in England in the 1970s as a writer for the New Statesman and the Evening Standard. From 1977 to 79, he worked for London's Daily Express as a foreign correspondent and then returned to the New Statesman as foreign editor, where he worked from 79 to 81. Hitchens has also served as the Washington editor for Harper's and as the U.S. correspondent for The Spectator and the Times Literary Supplement. From 1986 to 92, he was the book review critic at the New York Newsday. He's also been visiting professor at Berkeley, as I've indicated, at the University of Pittsburgh and the New School for Social Research. Mark Danner, a professor at the Graduate School of Journalism and staff writer for The New Yorker, has just returned from a reporting trip to Baghdad. He has written extensively on Haiti, Central America, the Balkans, and the development of American foreign policy in Europe and the Middle East. Danner joined The New Yorker's staff in April of 1990, 5 months after the magazine published his three-part series on Haiti, A Reporter at Large Beyond the Mountains, which won the 1990 National Magazine Award for reporting. On December 6, 1993, for the second time in its history, The New Yorker devoted its entire issue to one article, Danner's piece on an investigation into the notorious massacre in a remote Salvadorian town. He won an Overseas Press Club Award and other awards for this work. Danner's book on the massacre was published in 1994 and was recognized by the New York Times Book Review as one of the notable books of the year. Danner's study of Haiti, Beyond the Mountains, The Legacy of Duvalier, is forthcoming from Metropolitan Books. As you can see, we have much expertise to draw on tonight, and I want to thank you all in advance for your attendance. This promises to be an extraordinarily interesting and lively debate. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the Dean of the School of Journalism, Orville Schell, who will provide us with the ground rules for the discussion. Orville.
Well, thank you. It's great to see you all here. I think some testament to the fact that this is an important moment in the history of this country, if not the world. Indeed, I think it is something of a tipping point moment as our country finds itself in a war which it hadn't anticipated being as difficult as it is. And as we find the nation, I think, increasingly polarized around what we have done and what we might do. I think if we are to really try to find a reasonable balance sheet for where we are, there really is no better format than a debate. I think we're all rather weary of hearing people yell at each other on television. There's something reassuring about a formal debate where people actually have a chance to say what they mean, disagree with each other, and then challenge each other. I think the proposition that we are here to debate tonight is the following, and I quote President Bush: "I will defend my record at the appropriate time and look forward to it. I'll say that the world is more peaceful and more free under my leadership, and that America is more secure. That will be how I will begin describing our foreign policy." And in effect, I think this is what we are going to be discussing here tonight. I want to read one other quote, sort of by way of setting the backdrop for this debate. It goes like this: "Trying to eliminate Saddam would have incurred incalculable human and political costs. Apprehending him was probably impossible. We would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq. There was no viable exit strategy we could see, violating another of our principles. Going in and occupying Iraq, thus unilaterally exceeding the United Nations mandate, would have destroyed the precedent of international response to aggression that we hoped to establish. Had we gone the invasion route, the United States could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly and hostile land." That was uttered by the current president's father, and I think does suggest that even within a single family, it is possible to have widely differing views, whatever the president's father may currently think. Now, let me end here with an admonishment to you all. I ask you all to be civil, to be decorous. You will agree with one of these people or the other, that is certain. But please give both full measure of your attention without interruption.
The Dean, my valued colleague and comrade Allshell, has spared me my introductory paragraph, which I recently combed from the memoirs of George Bush and Brent Scowcroft, by reading it out to you himself. I think I'll just review it again in its entirety, though, to give you the full horror of Chapter 19 of A World Transformed, the work of President Bush Sr. and General Brent Scowcroft, because Orwell not unnaturally condensed it slightly. It's a dense paragraph of apparent prescience, first published in 1998. "Trying to eliminate Saddam, extending the ground war into an occupation of Iraq, would have violated our guideline about not changing objectives in midstream. Engaging in mission creep and incurred incalculable human and political costs. Apprehending him was probably impossible. We had been unable to find Noriega in Panama, which we knew intimately. We would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq. Going in and occupying Iraq, thus unilaterally exceeding the UN mandate, would have destroyed the precedent of international response to aggression that we hoped to establish. And had we gone the invasion route, the United States could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land." Now, if you make the relevant allowances of differences of emphasis and of confusion that I think is possibly willful here about the historical record, because after all, it was on the Bush-Scowcroft watch that Manuel Noriega was successfully apprehended. So pessimistic are they, in fact, in this account, that they fail to register one of their own successes. One could not, I think, have a better paraphrase of what is an emerging left-right conventional wisdom, extending all the way from Pat Buchanan to General Clark. And like its more recent emulators, it has another thing in common. It represents the anti-Saddam war, or the campaign for regime change in Iraq, or the American invasion of Iraq, or the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq, or whatever you choose to call it. It represents that outcome as something not other than elective, something that was voluntary, that was voulu, rather than as I will maintain, shall maintain, and have maintained all along, something inescapable, unpostponable, ineluctable. It's also, if you care to notice, and some of you will, the exact same logic that was also employed by President Bush and General Scowcroft and many others to justify their policy of staying out of Bosnia-Herzegovina, staying out of Kosovo, and in general of deciding to let the Balkans run as they did, rather than to intervene. So it's an argument with a long history that's not as glorious as its apparent prescience, prudence, or common sense may make it sound. That's not to say that I haven't noticed another thing about the present debate, which is a slightly distressing tendency by those who support the intervention of resting their case largely on the underreported good news. Like Mark, I've been in Iraq myself since we last met, and I certainly wouldn't deny, and I'm fond of asserting, that there's a great deal to celebrate in the new Iraq. The restoration of the ecology of the southern marshes, for example, the largest wetlands in the Middle East, the home of the Marsh Arabs, the emancipation of the media, and the consequent enormous burgeoning of electronic and print revolution, the emancipation of the schools and universities, the consolidation of Kurdish autonomy, the opening of the mass graves and the secret prisons. All of these are magnificent things, but those who want to take credit for them must, of course, by an axiom, automatically accept the blame for the huge lacunae in matters such as water or power or security that go along with this success. And in my view, if one is prepared to support a cause, one must be prepared to support it when it is going badly. The President's been widely lampooned by many a glib columnist, Ms. Dowd most notably, for saying that increased violence isn't necessarily a cause for despair or alarm, and may even be evidence of traction. Actually, he's quite right to take this apparently paradoxical view. Paradox is not the President's strong point, and his first venture into it was somewhat tentative. And to my knowledge, actually, and in my hearing, that view was first expressed by General John Abizaid, a very seasoned soldier in many theaters of war and revolution. But I will say that I think it's correct to diagnose that those who murder the officials of the United Nations, including our beloved former friend Sergio de Mello, the man who oversaw the independence and shamefully belated freedom of East Timor, and those who murder the officials of the Red Cross and who blow up the Jordanian embassy and set fire to oil pipelines and blow up water mains and shoot down respected Muslim clerics outside places of worship are making our point for us. And their desperation is an accurate guide. There's no justifiable way that a country as populous and important as Iraq can possibly be left at the mercy of such people, and I would argue, have always argued, that there never was any justification for leaving Iraq the prisoner of such people. So the counsel of prudence espoused by Bush and Scowcroft and their new liberal emulators is a sort of pseudo-realism. It's not as practical or as hard-headed or as prudent as it purports to be. Even in the year when it was instated, when it was decided to go no further in the quarrel with Saddam Hussein, it did have a number of very obvious disadvantages. Number one, it left Saddam Hussein, a psychopathic sadist and megalomaniac, in sole charge of Iraq and its people. It left the Iraqi people under United Nations sanctions, which the regime itself could mostly evade, but which very greatly punished the population and seems to have had a very degrading effect on society and its infrastructure. It did, as its authors, Bush and Scowcroft elsewhere, are forced to concede, involve the United States in watching from the sidelines as Iraqis who'd taken America's word and encouragement were mown down from the air in hundreds of thousands for rebelling on America's side and in its name. It left the Ba'athist regime free to continue work on weapons of mass destruction, which we know for certain that that regime was doing on a very grand scale until at the very least 1995. It left Saddam Hussein free to threaten his neighbors and to give support to jihad forces all around the world. The man most wanted, for example, in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, a man called Musab Yassin, fled straight from New Jersey to Baghdad, though there are still those in our intelligence services who prefer to grant Saddam Hussein the presumption of innocence in this and in several other matters. It also left Saddam Hussein free to try and assassinate former President Bush on his post-war visit to Kuwait, an act of such transparent lunacy that it far transcends any sneers, I think, about the present president wanting to avenge his daddy. It also demonstrates something else of importance, by the way, Saddam Hussein's urgent personal need for a revenge for his defeat in Kuwait in 1991. And that's a consideration that I believe deserves more attention than it's received. So this already lousy status quo wasn't really a status quo. It was, as you can see easily, very volatile and highly unstable. Saddam Hussein's speeches were becoming ever more demented, ever more extreme, and ever more Islamist in their tone. The flag of Iraq was amended to include a very threatening verse from the Quran. Gigantic mosques were being built in Saddam Hussein's name. He financed openly the suicide murderers in Palestine, whose avowed objective is the establishment of a theocratic dictatorship over all, whether believers or not believers. And even if, as seems remotely possible, it's a contingency that may be taken seriously, Saddam Hussein was, after 95, 98, largely bluffing about WMDs, that conclusion on its own would completely destroy the view maintained by very many liberals that for all his many crimes, Saddam at least understood the basic logic of deterrence and self-preservation. The saying was, if you remember, that he was in his box. Not a bit of it. Not only was he able to defy the UN, but with French and Russian collusion, he was increasingly able to circumvent the sanctions. The box was falling apart. Its supposed loony captive was becoming ever more toxic and uncontainable, and as he became older and crazier, there emerged the real prospect, the very clear prospect, of a succession passing to either Uday or to Qusay Hussein, or perhaps, if we were really lucky and the Iraqi people were well behaved enough, to both of them. Who wants to review the prospect of an Uday Qusay Hussein Iraq with equanimity? Who wants to see how that would pan out? 1 minute? Very well. Prepare for a rhetorical acceleration. Look, I'm glad we've got a bit of rebuttal. I'll be, if I haven't got my drift across by now, I won't have done at all. But the question, in other words, becomes this. Should the date or the timing of this unpostponable confrontation have been left to Saddam Hussein to pick? Or was it for those responsible forces in the international community to save Iraq from the undoubted traumatic implosion that was coming anyway, that was in our future, the meltdown of Iraqi society, the possibility of Sunni-Shia Kurdish civil war, the possibility of organized crime taking over the cities, the certainty that there would have been opportunistic interventions from outside, certainly from Turkey, probably from Iran. All of these things were going to happen. All of them are a great deal more menacing, would have been a great deal more menacing than the relatively contained and I would say unquestionably liberating effect of a preemptive, well thought out intervention. Seriousness about inspections demanded, as David... Sorry? Yeah. I'm willing to stop on a dime to respect the... I'll just have to close and say that for these reasons and others which I will share with you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, at the appropriate time, I suspect the Council of Prudence that I opened with, regard it as pseudo-realistic, as I regard its authors of being, and suspect even more the tendency of much of today's left to take its refuge in a neutralist and conservative isolationism. Thanks and bye for now.
Mark Danner, 10 minutes.
Gosh, that was good. You know, I feel saddened that I have to point out the distance of those beautiful remarks from the truth of what's going on the ground. It feels like, I don't know, willfully destroying a masterpiece somehow. Our subject tonight is, has Bush made us safer? I'm going to begin, before I take up some of what Christopher had to say, with an attempt to answer that question. And I ask all of you sitting in the hall to think about it in personal terms. Has Bush made me safer? My answer, in personal terms, is no. He hasn't. My answer would be that Bush has made us less safe. Bush has made us less safe because he willfully ignored what he heard from the Clinton administration about terrorism and about its preeminence as a threat to the United States. and the new administration preferred to focus on missile defense. George Bush made us less safe, or has left us less safe, because the president responded to an attack on Washington and New York by invading Afghanistan and then leaving it as insecure as he found it, letting al-Qaeda and the Taliban flow back into a vacuum that U.S. forces left. George Bush has made us less safe because he started a preemptive war with Iraq that did not have to be fought, that, despite everything Christopher just said, was not necessary, was not forced upon the United States. And though he concluded military action quickly, the war has gotten steadily worse. Since Christopher and I met last in Berkeley, 9 months ago, more than 350 Americans are dead. More than 2,000 are wounded, many of them grievously wounded. About 10,000, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Iraqis are dead. And the war, as I can testify from personal experience over the last couple of weeks, is getting worse. These are facts. When I arrived in Baghdad about 3 weeks ago, there were an average every day of 15 attacks on American forces. When I left, the average had gone up to nearly 35. Every day, 1, 2, 3 Americans are being killed in Iraq. And for all the talk about the fact that 80% of the country, 60% of the country, 95% of the country is perfectly fine and pacified, in fact, the area in which fighting is going on, in which Americans and Iraqis are being killed, is steadily broadening. Since major combat was declared over, the situation has steadily gotten worse, and over the last 2 weeks, it has gotten dramatically worse. And on the evidence I saw, and the people I spoke to, which included a number of senior generals, very, very able people, very intelligent people, with all of the technological resources of the United States of America at their command, my impression at the end of a lot of talk, a lot of interviews, many of them off the record, was that the American military is completely at sea. They don't know how to fight what is a growing insurgency. Bush has made us less safe because he has debilitated the main arm of defense against terrorism, and that is the United States intelligence agencies, which are now fighting in full-throated anger against the administration. You have a CIA battle against the White House as we sit here in this hall, which will, as the election approaches, get worse. Now, Christopher has just made an argument that all this was completely necessary. He argues that Saddam Hussein was strong, erratic, would have gained in weapons and power, and indeed would have reached the point where he would have handed over power to his admittedly quite disgusting progeny. He also argues that the Iraqi regime was getting weaker and was about to implode, and that such an implosion would have inevitably drawn in the neighbors of Iraq and into a situation in which the United States would be forced to intervene. I'll leave it to you to decide whether these two arguments cited in quick succession make sense next to one another. It seems to me he was either getting stronger or he was getting weaker. You can ponder that question, noble audience. And we can, for a moment, go back 9 months to the last time we appeared together in Berkeley. As I recall, Christopher argued very vehemently that the United States was under imminent threat from weapons of mass destruction, that those weapons were being hidden, that the inspectors who were sent by the United Nations to find them were thoroughly incapable of doing so, that indeed a nuclear weapon could be produced by the Iraqi regime in relatively short order, that the United States indeed was forced, under the shadow of these threats, to intervene. We have since found out that much of what we heard from the administration in making this argument was false. We know much of the intelligence information was, how should we put it, crooked, exaggerated, manipulated. We've heard this from leaks from within the administration, and particularly from the CIA, and we have seen it with our own eyes. Donald Rumsfeld said, "We know where these weapons are." Condoleezza Rice said, "This threat may become a mushroom cloud." All of these things were false. That doesn't necessarily constitute a decisive argument for not going to war with Iraq. It should leave us as citizens somewhat skeptical of the arguments now put forward by those who argued these things a mere few months ago. The citizens of the United States were essentially swindled into supporting a war that was not necessary. They were swindled into supporting a war that is getting more serious, more difficult by the day. They were told that an imminent threat had to be confronted, and in fact, I would argue, the country has become involved in a war that will end up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was a war against terror. Well, you have a situation on the ground where more and more jihadists are coming over what are now fairly open borders into Iraq. Were we worried at the time that Iraqis would be killing Americans? Well, they are doing so right now. Were we worried there would be more suicide bombing? Well, we see it on our television screens every day. Are we hearing arguments, as Christopher so delightfully put it in characterizing George Bush's talent for paradox, that these attacks show us quite simply that the opponent is becoming more desperate? Well, that's a fascinating argument. I guess it would lead us to believe that when the attacks stop, that is the time to really worry. I was in Baghdad the other day heading for an interview when my car was nearly thrown off the road by an enormous explosion. I was about a block away from the Red Cross. When I arrived, I was the first journalist there, one of the first people there. I found a scene of really indescribable horror. Flames 12, 13 feet high, curtain of black, dense black smoke, bodies everywhere. And this was the first of 4 suicide bombings that day. These were not going on 9 months ago in Iraq. The attacks on Americans, needless to say, were not going on 9 months ago in Iraq. There has been no proof of an imminent threat that was posed to Americans by Saddam Hussein. There is proof that the United States, having undertaken this foolish war, has increased the risk to American citizens, to America's young people who are now there dying every day and increasingly bewildered why they are there dying every day, and increased the risk to us. Because, as I predicted 9 months ago, Iraq could easily be made into an area for al-Qaeda to build its support and to increase its political backing in the world, in the Middle East especially. The United States has managed in the last 9 months to create exactly that. Bush has not made us safer.
Seven minutes for rebuttal. Hitchens?
Bill Clinton did actually make a speech on the steps of the Pentagon in 1998, which I can give anyone a copy of if they wish, saying that there was no escaping the fact that there would have to be a war with Saddam Hussein one day. It is the speech that is given out by every neoconservative organization in Washington as the classic statement. of what American foreign policy priorities were then and should have been. That Mr. Clinton didn't do anything about it and needn't necessarily be held to his charge. He didn't do that much about al-Qaeda either, except for bombing the wrong target in Sudan, lying about it, letting Osama bin Laden get away while looking better, and pursuing a Nobel Peace Prize for a futile Oslo process. If you don't believe that, you might be willing to believe that Afghanistan is less safe now, I think I quote Mark Tanner correctly, less safe now than it was when the Taliban was in power and it was the hinterland country for al-Qaeda. This is Afghanistan which for the first time in a very long time has its womenfolk going to school, is promulgating a constitution that was published yesterday, is building a road system between Kandahar and Kabul. It's the roads that allow warlordism, ladies and gentlemen. A warlord is someone who controls a stretch of non-highway road, and which has largely expelled and is killing every day members of the al-Qaeda and the Taliban militia. To say that we're less safe there would be the equivalent of saying that we were safer from al-Qaeda before September 11th, 2001, when unknown to us, but apparently known to our vaunted intelligence services, which have suffered so grievously from the Bush administration, known to the CIA and the FBI, though not passed on to one another or to the civilian leadership, was the fact that a secret army was being formed inside our borders with support from foreign regimes. That was known then. It just wasn't considered to be worthy of any serious action. The security we enjoyed when al-Qaeda and the Taliban controlled Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein controlled Iraq, when it must be admitted fewer Americans were then being killed and there was less violence, was the security of a fool's paradise. Is there anyone who thinks that we have not been for some time at war with the forces of jihad and the totalitarian states that underwrite them? Is there anyone who really thinks that the relationship between the Ba'ath Party and the Fedayeen Saddam and the jihadists who are now coming into Iraq or re-entering Kurdistan began only when the United States intervened? Nobody who studied the question could believe this for a second. The Ansar al-Islam group formed in Kurdistan under Saddam's protection. The subventions of money and propaganda support to jihad forces all around the world were an increasingly conspicuous feature of the Ba'athist regime. And as for inspections, I'd refer you to the work of Dr. David Kelly, a very distinguished former British arms inspector, whose regrettable suicide has embarrassed the Blair government so much, and to an article he wrote, only just published, alas, just before his death, saying that anyone who wanted inspections in Iraq had to be for regime change, because without a regime change there could be no verification, a perfectly commonsensical point. Now Iraq has been disarmed and hasn't yet been fully inspected, but is being inspected at last, and everyone is saying that they're resentful and surly about this extraordinary outcome. An outcome that, I will remind you, has forced the Iranian mullahs to accept mediation from at least two foreign ministers who wouldn't have bothered with it before, Monsieur de Villepin and Mr. Fisher, in alliance with Jack Straw, has forced them to accept mediation, United Nations supervision and inspection. Does anybody believe that the mullahs in Iran would be consenting to this level of intervention in their covert nuclear program if it were not, one, for the fact that the rival, the deadly enemy against whom they built this weaponry, has been removed and disarmed, first, and second, that a fairly useful pedagogic example has been afforded them of what will happen in case of defiance, that if they bluff, they will be taken seriously. Who objects to that? Who would feel safer if they'd gone on developing their program and lying about it, as they were doing until a couple of months ago? If we have to refer this matter, as under the rubric of this meeting, not known to me today actually, until today, but never mind, the slightly fatuous rubric of our own self-regard and our own safety, never mind, take it at its own face value. Yes, you are safer for the disarmament of Iraq. Yes, you are safer for the coming disarmament of Iran. Yes, you are safer for the physical destruction of the Taliban bin Laden regime in Kabul. And yes, you have President Bush to thank for it, and not President Clinton, and not George Tenet, and not the FBI, all of whom allowed these developments to occur and left us defenseless in our own hometowns under open skies. Now, the David Kay inquiry, the reports of which seem to me to be printed completely upside down. They said, David Kay discovers no shelves with neatly arranged stockpiles of weaponry. What does the David Kay report actually say? I trust everyone here has read at least some of it before coming along. The David Kay report finds, first, evidence of an enormous and consistent concealment program Call me old-fashioned if you will. By my logic of induction, a concealment program is evidence in itself. No one has a concealment program to conceal nothing. Scientists were threatened. 2 of them were shot for even considering cooperation with the earlier inspectors. Not that I think the Blix team was really looking, but in case they were looking, scientists were shot and intimidated and their families threatened with extermination if they cooperated. Designs and plans for missiles have been found by the K team, who are only a quarter of their way into their work, that far exceed, by thousands of miles, the limits that Saddam Hussein was allowed for the range of his missiles. Toxins have been found concealed in the private homes of scientists, in one case buried in a garden. It's quite extraordinary how far the depravity of the Saddam Hussein regime has been exposed in this matter of weapons of mass destruction by the K report. That was my 1 minute. I don't need another one.
Seven minutes, Mark Danner.
I think we're all faced with a question here, which is, are we citizens or are we dupes? Do we have the ability to make distinctions? Can we read the newspaper, listen to the news, listen to our leaders speak to us, and make judgments on our own? The evidence of the last few months gives us some pause, it seems to me, when we consider these questions. Christopher is clearly one of the 69% of Americans who the Washington Post claims believe that Saddam was behind 9/11.
If I had thought that, I would have said so. And I did have a spare minute.
Well, I would have been grateful if you had said it explicitly.
Then I would have had time for that too.
Well, I shall say it for you in any event.
Come to do.
You know, George Bush, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I think, actually came out after a particularly egregious performance by his vice president on one of the network shows, and came out and said, no, we have no evidence that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. I found this fascinating, that he felt himself obliged to say this, because, of course, the administration, over months and months, of very clever statements, very clever terminology, very cleverly dancing around the issue, was able to convince the great majority of Americans that, in fact, these 2 threats were the same thing. These Americans who were shocked by 9/11, as everyone was, who thought, here are our fellow citizens being killed while they're having their morning coffee, were perfectly willing to support a war against Iraq that they felt was replying to that immediate threat. Now, this kind of clever obfuscation is still being employed every day. We've seen a little of it from this stage. The fact is, when Christopher says Saddam was disarmed, Saddam wasn't disarmed. These weapons have not been found. I'll tell you another way that Saddam has not been disarmed. All across Iraq today, there are scores of enormous fields, the size of 1, 2, 3 football fields, filled with conventional weapons. Now, up till last March, these fields were guarded by soldiers, Iraqi soldiers. Now they're not guarded by anyone. No Iraqi soldiers, because the army, in America's wisdom, was dissolved. No American soldiers, because there aren't enough of them in country to do it. If you like, you can drive up to one of these depots with a pickup truck or something larger, pick up as many missiles as you like. That one that shot down the helicopter the other day, a day in which, by the way, I flew out of Baghdad on a conventional plane, that missile was probably simply picked up at an arms depot that isn't being guarded. This was a war to prevent weapons from getting in the hands of terrorists. Well, suddenly we have this enormous supply of weapons, perhaps 1 million tons, which is almost as many as exist in the United States, completely open for the picking. Completely open. Now, Christopher is making a lot of arguments about in fact, imminent threat. In fact, many of his arguments essentially rely on the perception that Saddam and al-Qaeda were essentially the same. They're not. They're not. They weren't the same. And the arguments made for supporting the war were misleading, obfuscatory, if you could put it that way, and relied on premises that have since been disproven. Saddam attacks his neighbors twice. Well, the Iranian war, America supported Saddam in attacking his neighbor. 10 years later, can we use that as a reason to attack him? Saddam gassed his citizens. He did, indeed, and the United States supported him during that time. Does that mean Saddam is not a threat? Not necessarily. It does mean that when you hear people making these arguments, you should reach for your wallet and make sure it's still in your pocket. You know, we're having an argument tonight, or a discussion that seems to have to do with national security, but it only marginally has to do with national security. What it has to do with is national integrity. Whether we as a democracy can make decisions based on facts, based on how the world actually is, whether we can make judgments about our security, what makes us safer and what makes us less safe, and can do it in a competent, judicious way, without our leaders misleading us. It seems to me from this stage we're seeing another example of such misleading. Before I left my house tonight, I looked at the current state of the New York Times and saw something that had just been posted. Blasts shake U.S. headquarters in Baghdad, injuring 4. 3 powerful explosions shook central Baghdad this evening in an apparent mortar attack on the headquarters of the American civilian authorities here. The explosions in rapid succession hit what appeared to be the sprawling American compound at about 7:45 local time. Spokesman said 4 people had been injured, but otherwise gave no details. Iraqi witnesses said they saw mortar fire from the Baghdad neighborhood attacking American headquarters. They're getting desperate. They're getting more and more desperate. They're now attacking American headquarters in Baghdad. The question is the threat from Iraq now less than it was when this war was begun by the Bush administration? Are Americans more or less in danger now than they were then? Christopher would tell you that things were about to fall apart. Saddam was getting stronger, Saddam was getting weaker, Iraq was getting stronger, Iraq was about to fall apart. One way or another, America had to invade. I ask you to look at the facts. Look at your newspapers every day. You want to talk about al-Qaeda, the terrorist threat? They're now in Iraq. They were claimed to be beforehand. They're there now. You just have to watch the network news every night and see how desperate they're becoming.
Seven minutes for Hitchens.
Well, I decided to become a journalist in part because I didn't want to have to rely on the newspapers. And I'm still very sorry for people for whom that is their source of news. I think I can decently maintain that the George Bush School of Paradox, as updated by Mark to try and catch me in saying that the Saddam Hussein regime was A, getting much worse, and B, getting more unstable, is not in fact a contradiction. Both things could be true, and both things would have been true, and the eventual implosion of the society and the state would have been the more gruesome and bloody as a result, and if it was unsupervised by the international community, even more bloody still. The obfuscation perpetrated by the Bush regime to convince 68% of the population that Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks must have been as clever as Mark says it was, since the administration never in fact made that claim, and has never made it, and has repeatedly repudiated it.
That's my point exactly.
This is quite a scale of obfuscation. It might argue for a certain amount of credulity on the part of the American public, but that, as I say, could also be to do with the newspapers that they are or are not reading. That there is a connection between Saddamism and jihadism, I think, need not be doubted. Cannot, in fact, be doubted. It was openly promoted and promulgated by the Iraqi regime. I stress again, the Ansar al-Islam group, a directly bin Ladenist group sponsored by them in Kurdistan, the support for the suicide murderers in Palestine, the support for jihad as a rhetoric, and, perhaps not negligible entirely, the consistent support by Osama bin Laden of the Ba'ath Party's rule in Iraq and his definition of it as the front line in the struggle against American imperialism, which, allowance made for rhetorical excess, he was correct in saying, yes, it is going to be a frontline state in this war. I'm not in favor of crying before we have been seriously hurt. The 87 billion hasn't kicked in yet. The United States has absolute military superiority in Iraq. To listen to Mark Downey, you would think we were on the verge of a military defeat in a war that quite simply cannot be lost, for the sake not just of the Iraqis, but of ourselves. The war's barely begun. I'm not in favor of the raising of any white flag at this point. Now, I may add on the matter of obfuscation and misapprehension about responsibility here, that though the Bush regime did not say, has never said that Saddam Hussein was directly behind 9/11, the flagship magazine of the peace movement, my former employers of the nation, are the publishers of a very widely sold and distributed book by Gore Vidal, which says that George Bush was the man behind 9/11. Now, fortunately, 68% of the American people are not so bloody stupid as to believe that. But perhaps 70% of the peace movement, judging by the meetings I've attended and discussions I've heard and emails I get, are fully up for considering that as the root cause of our ills. Let's be clear what we're talking about. Let's not be flippant about matters of security. There was and there is a Hitler-Stalin pact between the forces of jihad and the force of Ba'athist totalitarianism. It's an honor to be on the other side from it. It's an honor to have as many Iraqi and Kurdish friends as I can claim who've already decided to risk their lives to do it, and for a long time were risking their lives alone, and I maintain risking them for our sakes as well. Since we're talking about our safety, our security, if we just decide to limit ourselves to that, I'd like to put a proposition to you for your consideration. There's a tendency in this discussion so far, one that I very much reprobate, and one that I find a good deal in the New York Times, to name only one newspaper, and also in the Democratic Party, to watch this outcome as if to see, I wonder how it's going to work out. I wonder if Bush is going to win, or General Abu Zaid is going to win. I wonder if the Fedayeen Saddam and their allies in Al-Qaeda are going to win. Some days it looks bad for one side, some days not so bad. Who is daring to look at this as if they were spectators? Who is then worrying about and claiming that they feel more or less secure in their own persons and homes? Who is watching this as a neutral, is what I want to inquire. This society produces and maintains an enormous number of charitable, voluntary and non-governmental organizations. Mark and I, in our various excursions to the Balkans, for example, or in his case particularly to Haiti, have seen many cases. Kosovo is an outstanding one, where groups of this kind have made an extraordinary difference. Not just American ones, of course, but European ones too. I find it deplorable in the extreme that from the United Nations itself, which is part of the headquarters group of many of these NGOs, all the way down to the American community level, that there are not people saying, what can we do to help the people of Iraq and Kurdistan? Are we watching as spectators? How dare we do this? Why are there not people helping the women's groups of Iraq to recover and defend their liberties? Why are there no volunteers in Kurdistan to help uncover the mass graves, to help dig wells, to help repair the roads? Why are there not people? The place where I'm standing is so full of green people that you can hardly bear it sometimes. The largest wetlands in the Middle East are put to the torch by Saddam Hussein, first drained and then burned. It's the greatest ecological disaster ever registered by the United Nations. The smoke from it could be seen from the space shuttle. You had to watch it then because Saddam Hussein was in charge of it all, as he was of all those weapons that are now lying around but no longer under his control. Now you don't have to watch. You can do something about it. Or you could have waited for him to do what he did when he was leaving Kuwait, for example, and flood the entire Gulf with burning oil, destroying not just the ecosystem and the animals, but the surrounding territory. It was thought that those fires were going to take 4 years to put out, fires that were set by a madman as he was leaving the country he had desolated and profaned. Thanks to Mr. Red Adair of Texas, they were put out in 3 months. But everyone would prefer to sneer at that, wouldn't they, and say, oh, well, that's just profits for Halliburton and Bush's cronies. What must not be, and will not be by me at any rate, pardoned in this debate is any flippancy of that kind, any paranoid conspiracy theory garbage of the other kind I mentioned earlier, or any view that we have any right to regard this struggle as if it was a matter of indifference to us and we are able and willing to take bets on the outcome as affectless neutrals. Don't let that be said of any of you here tonight. Thanks.
Seven minutes, Danner.
We certainly aren't spectators. There's no question about that. I think Christopher's idea or appeal to the Greens, appeal to women's movements, appeal to NGOs here to help the Iraqis is very moving. Some of those people I saw on the way out of Baghdad. I flew out with the Red Cross, who were leaving. The United Nations left. The NGOs are gone from Iraq. They've left. They've been attacked. They've been killed. The two biggest car bombs were the Red Cross and the United Nations. All of the United Nations is gone. It's an enormous fort now, this hotel that was attacked, surrounded by sandbags, by layers of concrete barriers. It's an enormous wasteland that struck me as, I don't know, some kind of postmodern symbol for what we have become, that this is the United Nations in Iraq. So if you want to go help, you can't. Because the people who are setting these suicide bombs have a very clear strategy. They want to isolate the United States. They want to keep any allies from helping the United States. Witness the bombing of the Turkish embassy, which indeed made the decision by the Turkish government to send troops into a fiasco. That decision has now effectively been withdrawn. It's true we're not spectators. And since we are involved very directly, I'd appeal again for a clear-eyed vision of what's going on. Christopher said a moment ago that we have absolute military superiority in Iraq. This recalls a comment made over the weekend by General Ricardo Sanchez, who's the commander there, that these attacks that we've seen in recent days are strategically and operationally insignificant. That's not the case. No, the American army is not about to be brought to its knees in Iraq. But the American army is not able to fight effectively against what's happening there, against its foe there. It is simply going out on patrols, I went on a number of them, and waiting to be attacked. There's a paucity of intelligence about who these people are, where they are, what the order of battle is, what they're doing. And you know, it's very well, I think, for Christopher to say that we're not spectators. It's important to realize this isn't an argument about the war in Iraq. It's an argument about what might have been done otherwise and what the costs of this war are going to be. Not just financial costs, which are going to be enormous, not just cost in blood, which is going to be very high before we get out of there, but cost in, and this is where I agree with him, that Al-Qaeda and the war in Iraq can't be separated, cost in our own, what economists call opportunity costs, in what could have been done if this unnecessary war wasn't fought. The intelligence assets, the military assets, the moving of essentially a half of the United States military into an occupation that's getting more and more messy. And finally, the creation in Iraq of what is coming to look like a failed state, a place where terrorists can enter the border at their will, where they can carry out spectacular operations that are essentially recruiting tools. These things are intended to build a movement. And by giving them a ground on which to do it and a clear front on which to face American troops and kill them at will, the Bush administration has helped in that recruiting tool. I certainly don't want to stand here and say to you that the war in Iraq is lost. What I do want to do is point out that though the Bush administration has replied to each of these series of attacks by stating, usually in the words of the president, that we are firm in Iraq, we are determined not to leave, that in fact they have responded to each attack on the policy side by accelerating the movement to handing over security duties to Iraqis who are barely trained. They're handing them over to civil defense patrols that have 2 weeks of training. Now, does that matter? I'm not going to stand here and say we should get out of Iraq. I don't think we can get out of Iraq. But I also don't see the solution that will make the United States and everybody in this room and everyone we know and cherish more secure, safer. As time goes on there, as the attacks increase, the United States becomes less safe. The goal in Iraq is not simply to get out, but to leave a government, a situation that is stable, that doesn't threaten the country. As time goes on, it becomes more apparent that the situation before the war in Iraq was much less threatening to the United States than advocates of the war claimed, and that the situation in Iraq now is much more threatening to Americans than advocates of the war are willing to admit. And that is the simple situation we see in front of us. Yes, we have absolute military superiority. Let's see, does that phrase evoke any historical memories? I have a brother-in-law who was a Marine in Vietnam. No, Iraq is not yet Vietnam. Who was very impressed by a very conservative man, who was very impressed by that war. He always says to me, political correctness aside, that you have to remember that the guy with the feather can beat you. That is, the guerrillas on the ground can win. And if the United States withdraws from Iraq in a situation where things are getting worse, where the government is less stable, where you have neighboring countries asserting their interests, the Turks, the Iranians, increasing terrorism, a situation where Al-Qaeda benefits from having training bases, attacking American troops, all of this is happening right in front of us. If that happens, and it is happening, then this war will have made us much less safe. And you have to put that on one side of the scale and put the evidence that we were threatened before on the other. And I would argue to you that that evidence, that we were threatened before, is becoming slimmer by the moment.
Time.